Well, it's really great to be back with you again today. We have a rather unique presentation for you. This is going to be one on the book of Esther. And I would like you to kind of think about with this study that we're going to give today, I want you to think about the characters in this story. In some ways, they parallel some of the things that are going on in our own culture in our own time, or things that have happened, in the past 70 or 80 years. So there's an old saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I hope we're able to make some connections in this remarkable story today. But anyway, I'm glad you're with us. I hope you enjoy this. I want to go to our picture that Sherry took for us. You've seen some of these flamingo pictures previously. What I love about this one is that big one on the left. You can just see its legs. It is leaning down and it's just about to check on its own egg, which is sitting on a very small mound, which I'm going to guess this is kind of a young bird, maybe its first nest, because it's like 1/3 the size of all the nests around it. It just sort of tells a really fascinating story of this young bird. And not only that, normally you think of flamingos in pink. Well, the color of a flamingo is based on its nutrition, what it eats. So Sherry, thank you for this fabulous picture. I hope you enjoy that. Um, it's just one of those really, really rare moments that Sherry captures for us. So let's jump into our conversation today. So, Esther, this entire story is about loyalty. Loyalty to whom? Well, Esther, of course, and Mordecai are loyal to God. But then you have Haman, who's loyal to himself. And then you have the king who seeks to be loyal to his nation. All I'm going to say is that there's some very interesting dynamics that take place in this remarkable story. So I want to jump right in. And by the way, I want to begin with the book of Daniel because this is a parallel story in some ways. So a short story in Daniel chapter 3. It reads this way. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you set up. Now that's pretty pointed, but the parallel to Daniel's three friends are found kind of in the book of Esther, and I'll point that out as we go along. I want you to meet Xerxes the First, also in the book of Esther, known as King Ahasuerus, a king in Persia. Persia, by the way, is a huge country at this time. I want you to meet Queen Vashti for just a moment, who simply refuses the orders of her king because they're having a drunken party. And I want you to meet Haman the Agagite, who wanted power and influence at any price, and whose descendants, King Agagite, hated the Jews, God's people. Now, there's more characters in this story. Let's move on. I want you to meet Esther. She was an orphan. Of course, she rose to fame and through God's providence saves all the Jewish people in Persia. And of course, one of the great heroes of this story is her uncle Mordecai. Now, here's what's unique about Mordecai. He honored his king and at the same time refused to bow to Haman. And I kind of think that's because of Haman's heritage and his hatred of the Israelites, of the Jewish people. Now, Mordecai trusted God, and it would be through prayer and fasting that would change his entire world. So, we begin with this incredibly wild party, intoxicated guest and a king, a little bit tipsy there. Now, when the king sent for his queen Vashti, she refused, and that refusal of a king could have cost her her life, but in this case it cost her her crown. And a command went from the king to all the Persian women that wives, are you ready for this, must honor their husbands. Now, most people miss this part of the story. It's just one of those really, really amazing sights. Just think about all these servants of the king getting on their horses and going out and making this proclamation, all you women of Persia, you better honor your husbands. Well, that happened. Next, a new queen comes onto the scene, and it turns out to be Esther, a young Jewish girl who had been orphaned and raised by the wise uncle Mordecai. And you're going to see the wisdom of Mordecai as I share this story for you. Now, the really remarkable thing about Esther, she followed her uncle's instructions carefully, almost to the T. One of the things she was told was not to reveal her ethnicity. Now, Mordecai spent most of his days at the city gate. That's the king's gate. It was also a marketplace, but what was even more intriguing, this is where all the judicial proceedings were handled, is at the king's gate. So on this particular day that we're talking about, Mordecai is sitting out there, and he overheard two men plotting to murder the king. Now, Esther at this point had become the queen, and he goes to Esther, and he tells her to inform the king of the murder and do it in his name. As a result, Mordecai's name gets entered into the book of Chronicles. That is a book of records that the king kept. That becomes a significant part of the story later on. Now, Haman, as I've said, was part of the lineage, most likely, of King Agag, the Amalekite king who hated the Jews and tried to get rid of them many times. Now, Haman got permission to be honored in all the public spaces and have people bow to him whenever he passed by. And the king gave him a signet ring, put it into law, and everywhere that Haman went, the people were ordered to bow down. Just like the three worthies in the book of Daniel, they were required to bow down. And if you didn't, there would be consequences. So when Haman was in the marketplace one day, Mordecai absolutely refused to bow down to him. He refused to honor him, causing Haman to plot not only the demise of Mordecai, but also all of Mordecai's people in Persia. Now that is a this would have been a complete eradication of the Jewish people. It has, and this is what I said earlier, it has kind of that echo in it of how the Nazis wanted to get rid of the Jewish people. Jewish people and other ethnicities, over 6 million of them eventually died in the Holocaust. But in this story, it had the potential of being one of the earlier, or maybe first Holocausts, because of Haman's hatred, not only of Mordecai, but of all Jewish people. The plot by Haman described the Jews as different from all other people. And I want you to remember this phrase. Therefore, they did not have the right to exist. Now, I want to tell you that every time we've ever seen a massacre of people, it was when certain individuals decided that that group over there did not have the right to exist. Now, King Ahasuerus agreed with Haman. He signed it with his signet ring, the decree to have them all put to death in the empire, as Haman said, you know what, these people don't have the right to exist. And the king went along with it. not realizing who his queen was, because Mordecai told her not to reveal her ethnicity. Now, Haman, the enemy of the Jews, was just about to get rid of Mordecai and just about to get rid of all the Jews, now listen carefully, who were also Sabbath keepers. That is an important part of understanding this story, especially if we're going to make it relevant to the times in which we live. The king was restless one night. He couldn't sleep, so he got out the book of Chronicles and was reading through them. He reads of how Mordecai saved his life by reporting the two assassins by Queen Esther in his name. Let me read it to you. Esther chapter 6, verse 3. We begin here. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Now the king's servants who attended him said, "Well, nothing's been done for him." So the king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. And if I'm correct, I think it was in Haman's front yard. In verse 5, it reads, "The king's servant said to him, 'Behold, Haman is standing in the court.' Well, the king said, 'Let him come in.' So Haman came in, and the king said to him, 'What is to be done for a man whom the king desires to honor?' And Haman said to himself, 'Oh, whom the king desires to honor more than me?'" So Haman's assuming that this is going to be all about him. This is the danger of having a really big ego. Egotistical moments get us all in trouble. Then Haman said to the king, "For the man to whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to be honored, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man to whom the king desires to honor.'" Boy, Haman is having a picnic with this one. He really is in anticipation that right now, at just any moment, this is about to be his, well, next major event in his life. But I want you to pay attention to verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, "Take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said." I just wish I could see his face. The shock he had to have some remarkable self-control in this moment in the presence of the king. So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." And here we have Mordecai going through the city, making this proclamation. Let's pick it up now in verse 12. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried home, mourning, with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh his wife and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. And then his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, "If Mordecai, for whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now, I want to just take a moment and give you a quick sketch. Esther is on a mission to save her uncle and her people. And the way she chose to do that is she risked her own future by coming into the presence of the king without permission and said, I want to invite you and Haman personally to a banquet. Now, in the story, we know that she chose not to give all the details in the first banquet and then planned a second banquet in which she would then disclose what her purpose was. So we know the outcome of the story. Esther holds two banquets before exposing Haman's plot to eradicate her people. But I do think we have to ask some important questions, like, well, what are the lessons for today? Now, Haman ends on his own gallows. Let's pause here for just a moment and process this. Now just think through this. Here's a man who says there's a group of people we want to get rid of. It's time for them to go. Now, I told you I'd connect this to end times, the times in which just before the Lord comes. And here's what's really remarkable about that story. You see, in Revelation 17, there is a war that is declared on God's people again. Just like what Haman wanted to do, only it's done with the kings of the earth. But in the book of Esther, we see what the outcome is of that ego, of that idea that men and women get in their minds that certain kinds of people do not have the right to exist. We can call that prejudice, but it's even deeper and bigger and more evil than that. Esther shows us the outcome of that kind of thinking. Now, there's more lessons for today. Think about this. Like Daniel's three friends, Mordecai stood on his convictions of refusing to worship men, especially men who were abusive and hateful of others' religion. Now, we live in an unusual time. Today, we're living in a time in which immigrants and individuals that people don't like, they would just as soon get rid of them, just have them completely gone. Now, there needs to be responsibility taken, I understand that, in every nation with how you handle the influx of people coming in and out. I want you to know I understand that, and so do you. We all understand that. But what do you do when a culture or society becomes abusive and hatred of others? Not just their religion, but just even their ethnicity alone. History teaches us some profoundly important lessons. In the book of Esther, here's a lesson that is worth learning today. In the book, God does the role of saving. We have our role of exercising our faith in God. And I think that's profoundly important. Now, you know, when this unfolded in the book of Esther, the first thing Mordecai said, Esther, get the word out to everybody, all of the Jewish people. Have them fast and pray and seek the Lord. Okay? And she did that. And yes, the people did that. And yes, there was an intervention, but it wasn't by man. God intervened. God does all of the saving. Now, that's just absolute gospel language. May I say that parallels precisely all of the New Testament of being saved by faith alone. Mordecai and Esther exercised faith in prayer and fasting that their God would be able to save them. Now, here's another lesson. Now, we learn this lesson as people of faith. We have a responsibility to look out for others. Now, Mordecai looked out for the king, saved his life. Mordecai looked out for his niece, Esther. he also looked out for the well-being of all of his people. And that's profoundly important. We cannot underestimate the significance of that. There's just something about people of faith who look around and their world is bigger and they see value in others. Now, here's another lesson we learn. We learn that Mordecai did not act alone. He made the call for fasting and prayer. He needed the assistance of Esther, who, by God's providence, God himself had placed her in a position of great importance. Mordecai learned the value of people as a person of faith. I think that's a significant and really beautiful lesson. You see, the role of faith in difficult and political situations is profoundly important for us to understand. You see, what Mordecai refused to do was to honor hate, to be complicit in Haman's public persona of, you worship me, I'm the great man. Mordecai would not participate in that at all. To not honor man, but he would honor God. Because I think it was a compromise of Mordecai's faith to bow down to Haman. In the same way that Daniel's 3 friends refused to bow down to the king who said, you do this or you die. See, what if Mordecai had decided to use Haman for his own purposes, for influence or power? As a man of faith, Mordecai placed his allegiance on God alone. It was his loyalty to God that allowed him, and I think this is a profoundly important lesson, allowed him to both support, may I say, the pagan king, and to help remove Haman, a pagan nationalist. In other words, as a pagan, worshiping pagan gods, his nationalism was to eradicate a certain kind of people out of the culture of Persia using the power of the king. That's nationalism, if you would, in its simplest kindergarten form. So as we come down to this part of the story, I think there's some really important questions we have to ask ourselves. Where are your loyalties? To whom do you owe allegiance? Now, as a person of faith, is your first thought about the love of God and God's love for your neighbor? Is that the first act of a person of faith? Well, I would like to think it would be. I think that is just a fundamental truth of Scripture. I think it's a fundamental truth in this story in the book of Esther. For example, if Mordecai had been politically driven rather than faith-driven, this story would not have the same outcome. I think there's a caution for us as Christians when we read the book of Esther that is profoundly important, and may I say, remarkably clear. And I mean, it is as clear as day. Can we have a divided loyalty? Can we have our political loyalty and at the same time have loyalty to God and claim the two are equal? In the book of Esther, that was not possible to do. It was possible to honor the king, yes, but notice Mordecai honored God in saving the king's life. His first and foremost loyalty was to God alone. So if Mordecai had been politically driven rather than faith-driven, this story would not have the same outcome. He would have used Haman as a stepping stone, probably to gain more power and more influence and try to save his own people in his own strength. What if Daniel's friends were politically driven in the king's court? They would have readily bowed to the golden image. How about us today as Christians? Where are we at in the story in our nation? Are we willing to bow to all of the political drama that's going on? Or are we more like Mordecai, willing to stand by faith alone and trust in God completely and only as loyal to him? How do you see yourself today? Loyalty to man or loyalty to God? That becomes the core issue, actually, in almost every book of the Bible, isn't it? I feel we need to be responsible citizens. I think we need to vote. I think we should do everything we can to make a healthy and safe society. But I think what's really beautiful in the book of Esther, that outcome was done by trusting by faith in God. Notice Romans 12:1 and 2. Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, and holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, and that which is good and acceptable and perfect. I want to go to the picture Sherry brings. This is one of those really beautiful snowstorms in the mountains. Here's this leaf on this bush. All the other leaves are gone, and this one is just standing there holding up that beautiful snow, beautiful rust colored. Thank you, Sherry, for this profoundly beautiful moment in nature. Who are we loyal to? You take care now. Bye-bye.